Marshall McLuhan's statement that the medium is the message is often quoted, but less often deeply examined. What this statement suggests is that the form itself determines what can be expressed, what must be simplified, and what is left out entirely. It changes the information we receive. This becomes particularly important when dealing with the past. If someone pulls out a pistol in a movie set in ancient Rome, you would probably notice that and recognize that it wasn't historically accurate. But if that same film condenses a multi-decade conflict into just 2 hours, you may not recognize that, in turn, it is prioritizing certain aspects of the past while marginalizing others. The Trojan War presents a useful case study for this kind of analysis, not because it is a clearly documented historical event, but because it is not. Rather than beginning from concrete historical events, we are dealing with a tradition that has been shaped and reinterpreted across centuries and all different types of media. This allows us to raise a different kind of question. Not which version is most accurate, but rather, what does each medium emphasize and what does it obscure? Instead, we look into how the medium shapes the story. Before comparing media, it is important to clarify the historical status of the Trojan War itself. Archaeological work at Hisarlik, which is commonly identified as the site of Troy, has confirmed that a significant settlement did exist there and was destroyed multiple times, at least once by fire. Some of the destruction layers suggest that it existed roughly in the late Bronze Age, or around the 12th century BCE. However, this is about as much as we know. Evidence does not confirm the existence of a unified Greek expedition, nor a 10-year siege, as is described in later renditions of the legend. As Andrew Dalby argues in his book Rediscovering Homer, what we are dealing with is not an accurate historical account of an event, but a narrative tradition that may preserve fragments of real events as Homer believed them to be. These fragments, such as local conflicts, raids, or regional wars, were expanded, exaggerated, and combined over time through oral transmission. Dalby suggests that while there may be a historical core, the story behind the Iliad is not able to be confirmed in any precise form. This makes it uniquely possible to compare modern forms of media with a so-called historical medium like Homer's Iliad, while still recognizing that Homer does not offer a strictly accurate historical account, and nor did they intend to. The Iliad emerges from a long-standing oral poetic tradition. Long before it existed as a written text, it was performed by singer poets, who composed poetry in performance. These poets relied on established narrative patterns, which made it possible to transmit stories at a large scale without relying on verbatim memorization. This oral system allowed for flexibility and variation across different performances. The transition from oral performance to written text likely occurred in the 8th or 7th century BCE, as the Greek alphabet came into wider use. At that point, a version of the poem was committed to writing by the figure known as Homer, whoever that may be. This shift from oral song to written text introduces a significant chronological gap. The events depicted in the Iliad are traditionally associated with late Bronze Age and the mythic memory of the Trojan War, whereas the poem was recorded centuries later, during the early Archaic period. As a result, Homer is not actually describing his own historical moment, but representing a distant past shaped by generations of oral tradition. In addition, the sheer length and complexity of the Iliad suggests that the written poem represents a consolidation of material that would likely have circulated in shorter performances in an oral context. Performing the entire Iliad orally would have taken far too long for one sitting, whereas writing made it possible to significantly expand the epic on a scale that oral performance alone could not have sustained. This marks a significant transformation in how the story was transmitted. As a result of these factors, the world of the Iliad is not historically consistent. In his book Ancient Warfare, Van Wees notes that the forms of combat described in the epic do not cleanly correspond to a single historical model. Instead, it combines elements from different periods, suggesting that the poem reflects a narrative or heroic past rather than an accurate depiction of warfare at any one moment in time. It is also important to note that routing was a common feature of historical warfare, as armies frequently broke formations or withdrew when confronted with sustained pressure. In the Iliad, however, such behavior is absent or narratively reframed. While warriors may momentarily fall back, entirely running away is rare. The selective portrayal reflects a convention of epic poetry itself, which prioritizes honor and heroic resolve rather than realism. As a result, the epic presents combat not as it commonly was, but as it needed to be imagined in order to sustain its heroic arc. So, while epic allows for a longer narrative story than an oral one may be able to sustain, we must recognize the conventions of the medium. Epic poetry does not aim to precisely reconstruct the past. Rather, it prioritizes thematic elements, such as honor and rage, over accuracy. This fact does not make the Iliad any more or less of a valuable source for gathering information about its topic, whether that be the time it was written about or the time it was written in. But it does mean that we must recognize the way the medium changes the information and the story that is presented. Film plays by a different set of rules, shaped by its own conventions and genre-specific expectations. Unlike epic poetry, which leaves room for interpretation when it comes to the world that the story inhabits, film must present its world visually and concretely. People, places, and events need to appear on screen in a specific form and within a fixed span of time. Because of this, ambiguity is often reduced in favor of clarity. This is a trade-off that can both enhance and limit the story being told. Characters, in particular, become fixed in film in a way they never are on the page. Once an audience sees Troy, it becomes difficult not to picture Brad Pitt when thinking about Achilles. This visual fixation can be helpful. It gives the character a recognizable face, physicality, and presence that remain in memory. The same applies to settings and actions, which are presented as precise, detailed realities with events unfolding in real time, rather than flexible descriptions shaped by the reader's imagination. This specificity is both a strength and a limitation. An epic poem can describe an ancient Greek war camp loosely, allowing consumers to imagine it in many different ways. A film, by contrast, must present one specific version with a defined layout and set of visual details. While this makes the setting immersive, it also creates the impression that there may be one single correct version of the camp. In reality, no such definitive war camp existed. These spaces would have varied widely, depending on circumstance. Film collapses that historical variability into one concrete image, because the medium makes it so. Cinema is further constrained, and aided, by its limited duration. A story that unfolds across many years in an epic poem must be compressed into just a few hours of screen time. As a result, events are condensed, timelines are simplified, and entire subplots may be removed to maintain the narrative coherence. This compression is a defining feature of the filmic medium. While it limits the scope of the story, it can also make the narrative more accessible or easily understood. Where reading the Iliad may take days or weeks, Troy can be experienced in a single afternoon, with visuals and sounds intensifying the emotional impact. One of the most significant differences between the Iliad and Troy is the removal of divine intervention. In the epic poem, gods such as Athena, Aphrodite, Hera, and Apollo act as characters who actively influence events and human decisions. In the film, however, events are framed entirely as the result of human choice, politics, and personal motivation. This omission is not merely arbitrary, but it reflects another limitation of the medium. Including the gods would require film to visually represent Olympus and divine beings, rather than allowing them to remain imagined in the mind. Portraying gods convincingly on screen without diminishing their power, mystery, or symbolic role does pose a significant challenge. Furthermore, it would require the addition of an entirely different subplot, which would make the film more confusing to follow, going against one of the advantages of the medium, which is comprehensibility. As a result, the film chooses a more human-centered interpretation of the story, shaping it to fit the expectations of the medium. Film excels at creating a sense of presence that attaches the consumer to the story it is telling, by helping viewers visualize and experience what they are imagining. Though, as a result, it does narrow what is up for interpretation. Video games introduce a fundamentally different element from any other medium: interactivity. Unlike epic poetry or a film where the audience receives a narrative planned out in advance, video games require the player to participate directly in the unfolding of events. This experience is not observed, but produced through actions that the individual takes. and that fact alone makes games a very different medium with different consequences. However, not all games operate the same way, despite being grouped under one category. The distinction between real-time strategy and role-playing games is particularly important in how stories can be interpreted. A role-playing game, such as Assassin's Creed Odyssey, would place the player within the narrative as an individual. This means that you are playing as if you are the character. This style emphasizes character development by prioritizing individual goals and individual decision-making. Total War Troy, however, the game that I looked at, is a real-time strategy game, which, rather than placing the player inside the story as one character, puts them in control of entire armies, territories, and resources. The focus shifts from individual perspective to large-scale coordination, where the player directs the story as a whole instead of being one person involved. Now that we understand this distinction, it is also useful to look more closely at the underlying structure of video games. By breaking the structure down, we can have a better understanding of what is actually happening when we play. This diagram captures the structure of games in relation to the player agent, or you. At the center is the player agent, who is not simply a character within a story, but is an active agent that is interacting with multiple systems at once. Surrounding the player are the core elements of gameplay: resources, agents, tools, obstacles, and metrics. These core elements are present in nearly every video game, while the specific details that branch off from them describe Troy, Total War. This model helps demonstrate the underlying logic of video games as systems rather than purely narrative experiences. Instead of moving linearly from one event to the next, the player engages with an entire network that generates the events unfolding within the game world. Actions in one area produce consequences in another, creating a chain of connected outcomes. For example, managing resources can influence army strength, which in turn affects territorial expansion, which then shapes diplomatic relationships with neighboring factions. In this way, gameplay emerges through the interaction of multiple systems operating at the same time. These systems are directly influenced by the choices made by the player agent. In Total War games, players generally make three major categories of decisions: diplomatic choices, economic choices, and tactical choices. Ideally, each choice is made with the intention of advancing towards the goals established by the game. In this case, our primary goal is to conquer the Greek world, so every choice we make should, in some way, contribute to expansion. Using this model, in Total War Troy, war is not presented as a sequence of individual encounters and decisions, but as a process of coordination across these systems. For this reason, among others, war in Total War is governed by a structured set of rules that determine how these actions produce their connected outcomes. As a result, the emotional and thematic elements central to the epic tradition, such as Achilles' rage, become secondary to gameplay systems that support the goal. Rather than being explored as a psychological phenomenon to deepen the story, Achilles' rage is translated into mechanics, such as increased combat effectiveness and special abilities. Internal human experiences are, in video games, externalized into quantifiable systems that the player agent can manage and strategically use within gameplay. The medium of video games requires these systems to function consistently, since gameplay depends on clear and repeatable mechanics. Unlike narrative storytelling, where events can occur according to dramatic necessity, video games operate through systems that apply mostly equally to all units, characters, and elements within the game world. Even the epic hero Achilles is still bound by these systems. Although he is based on a legendary figure, within the game he cannot function as a completely unrestricted narrative hero. Instead, he operates as a unit with defined capabilities, limitations, and statistics, and he functions within the broader system. While Achilles does possess special abilities and enhanced powers that distinguish him from ordinary units, these mechanics are designed to strengthen his normal gameplay abilities rather than free him from the rules of the game entirely. He may be significantly stronger than other soldiers, but he cannot simply go on an unstoppable rampage across the battlefield. The difference between Achilles in the video game and the movie becomes especially clear when we compare clips of the hero in battle. In the video gameplay clip, we can see that Achilles is sent alone into the range of several enemy troops. Even though he is powerful and can survive much longer than ordinary units might, the game still limits what he can do. He cannot kill endless waves of enemies by himself, and the surrounding troops still pose a real threat to him that he may not single-handedly be able to defeat. The systems of the game continue to regulate the battle through health, damage, stamina, and combat mechanics. This is clearly visible in his status box, which labels him as winded and tired as the fighting goes on, sometimes even noting that he is losing decisively. By the end of the clip, enemy soldiers manage to wound the hero and take him out of the battle entirely. In contrast, Achilles is presented very differently in the movie during the Myrmidon assault on the beaches of Troy. He charges ahead of the army and cuts through large numbers of enemies almost effortlessly, appearing almost superhuman. Rather than feeling constrained by a larger system, he seems to move outside of ordinary rules entirely. He seems invincible, more like the epic poem would describe such a hero. Watching these two clips together highlights the difference between the media of narrative cinema and video games. The film allows Achilles to function as an unstoppable hero, while the game must balance him within a structured system that applies to every unit on the battlefield. This important difference, in turn, shapes how the story is experienced and reinterpreted by the audience. Across the three media, the Trojan War is transformed through different interpretations of the past, because each medium reshapes the story according to its own strengths, limitations, and methods of communication. In the Iliad, the story functions not as a precise historical record, but as a thematic exploration of heroic culture, adapted from generations of oral storytelling. The epic emphasizes ideas such as honor, glory, fate, and divine influence. These themes are important because they reveal the moral values and societal ideas of the world that Homer presents. Wolfgang Petersen's film Troy adapts the same story into a visual narrative similarly shaped by the conventions of modern cinema. The film removes the supernatural intervention prevalent in the epic and instead presents the conflict as one entirely due to human ambition. Though time constraints force many of the elements of the plot to be compressed or eliminated, film succeeds in the area of emotional impact. Ancient warfare becomes something audiences can visualize, experience, and connect with, even if that experience is shaped more by cinematic realism than historical accuracy. And finally, strategy games, such as Total War Troy, reinterpret the story of the Trojan War in an entirely different way by transforming it into a system of player decisions and outcomes. Instead of primarily observing heroes or cinematic action, players actively manage armies, resources, morale, and battlefield formations. Warfare becomes interactive and strategic rather than symbolic. The game, too, is shaped by the conventions of its medium. Complexity is simplified into mechanics that must remain balanced, understandable, and enjoyable for players. In return, gameplay allows individuals to connect more to what is being portrayed, creating a large impact on the learner. Importantly, none of these media should be understood as fully accurate reconstructions of a historical event. Each adapts the story of the Trojan War according to the strengths and limitations of its medium. Epic poetry emphasizes heroic values, film prioritizes emotional and visual clarity, and games focus on interaction, strategy, and player agency. As a result, each representation highlights certain aspects of the past, while simplifying or reshaping others. These versions are therefore not competing attempts to tell a single correct story of the Trojan War, whatever that may be. Instead, they function as different lenses through which the audiences can engage with the story presented. Together, they reinforce the argument that the medium itself shapes not only how the story is communicated, but also how that story is ultimately able to be understood. Returning to Marshall McLuhan, the most important implication is not simply that different media show stories differently, but that they have the power to shape historical understanding in fundamentally different ways. The medium through which audiences encounter the Trojan War influences what they believe is important about it. If someone experiences the war primarily through Homer's Iliad, they are likely to understand that it's a story about honor and mortality, walking away with a deep view of ancient Greek values. Whereas experiencing the video game may lead someone to value the importance of leaders who position their armies or the supplies that allow them to function. None of the possible representations are inherently more valid than the other, because each captures a different dimension of the story. All three are therefore meaningful interpretations rather than being simply right or wrong. All three are also valuable as they may appeal to different audiences, and the visual elements of a movie may have a greater impact on one, whereas the interactivity of a game may have a greater impact on another. However, each medium also contains biases, assumptions, and limitations that shape how the audience interprets events. Epics may exaggerate heroism. Films often simplify complexity to create narrative clarity and entertainment, and games can reduce human experiences into systems, mechanics, and win conditions. What is emphasized in one medium may be ignored or minimized in another. For this reason, understanding the medium itself becomes essential before fully accepting or writing off its interpretation. A critical reader, viewer, or player must recognize that no historical representation is neutral. Every medium frames events differently, chooses what to include or exclude, and guides audiences toward a particular interpretation of the past, even if it's just due to the convention of the medium. Being aware of these structures allows historians and audiences to identify potential distortions, omissions, or simplifications, rather than passively accepting the representation as a complete historical reality. This is especially important in the modern world, where films, games, and digital media are increasingly shaping public understanding of history and events. While these modern media can be useful tools, if audiences fail to critically examine how they operate, it can lead to mistakenly accepting one version as the truth. However, when approached critically, these media can complement one another by revealing different perspectives on the same event that, in turn, widen one's point of view. A good consumer of media, therefore, does not simply ask whether a representation is accurate, but also asks how the form of the media shapes its interpretation of the topic. In this sense, Marshall McLuhan's idea that the medium is the message becomes essential for historical analysis itself. To understand the past responsibly, one must also understand the medium through which it is being presented.